Okay, so let's begin, since I remembered, let's begin with our traditional beginning. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the world, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There, he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, Master of the universe, listen, I do not know how to light the fire, but I'm still able to say the prayer. And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save the people once more, would go into the forest and say, I do not know how to light the fire, I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient. It was sufficient. The miracle was accomplished. Then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Rizhin to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head on his hands, he spoke to God. I'm unable to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is to tell the story, and this must be sufficient. And it was. So for today, I chose a story that takes into account that we are after Lag BaOmer, and how come I don't find the thing that I picked out? Hold on a second, sorry.
Here's John.
1 second.
Beryl, whatever you're eating looks good.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It is. It finally recovered from COVID. Weren't being killed. There was no calves liver until now.
Okay, bear with me another second here. Unfortunately, I thought I did it and I didn't do it.
Ah.
Okay. So now, here we are. And now I'm going to share the screen. And here we go. So the this is as it says in the title, it's a story about a wedding. And the idea is that after the 33rd day of the Omer, after Lag BaOmer, in traditional circles, weddings take place. The first 32 days, 33 days of the Omer, the period between Passover and Shavuot, there's a custom to treat those days as days of mourning, and therefore people refrain from getting married. Now that custom is not as strong as it used to be, but there, people that were in the Jewish wedding industry, they knew that was their month that they had off. And then after Lag BaOmer, that became busy season again. So anyway, so here's a wedding story, and it's by Abraham Kahan. As you can see, there's a long introduction here. He was for 50 years the senior editor of the Jewish Daily Forward. He was a force to be reckoned with in the Jewish community. He lived a nice long life, 1860 to 1951. He wrote a really terrific novel called The Rise of David Levinsky. I recommend it highly. And it's a classic of coming to coming into one's own. And it's about a Jewish immigrant who comes to America and is transformed by the experience. I don't want to say what that means. But so he was, an important figure, important writer, and editor, and promoter of literature in America. So this is a short story, and it's called A Ghetto Wedding. I'm going to make it a little bigger here. There we go. So I open up the floor. Who wants to do us the honor of reading for us today?
Well, if nobody else volunteers, even though I did it last week, I'll give it
All
to
right. Well, you're stuck. What can I tell you? You're stuck with it for today.
All right. Hopefully the words are easier this week. Had you chanced to be in Grand Street on the starry February night, it would scarcely have occurred to you that the ghetto was groaning under the culmination of a long season of enforced idleness and distress. The air was exhilaratingly crisp, and the glare of the cafes and millinery shops flooded it with contentment and kindly goodwill. The sidewalks were alive with shoppers and promenaders and lined with peddlers.
Okay, this is taking place on Grand Street, the famous Grand Street. We're talking about the Lower East Side of Manhattan. During a period when it was, one of the most densely populated places around. And of course, it was a Jewish ghetto, not with walls around it, but simply because that's where all the Jews found themselves. Go ahead.
Yet the dazzling, deafening chaos had many a tale of woe to tell. The greater part of the surging crowd was out on an errand of self-torture, straying forlornly in inexorable window displays. Men and women would pause here and there to indulge in hypothetical selection, to feast a hungry eye upon the object of an imaginary purchase, only forthwith to pay for the momentary joy with all the pangs of awakening to an empty purse. Many of the peddlers, too, bore piteous testimony to the calamity which was then preying upon the quarter. Some of them performed their task of yelling and gesticulating with the desperation of imminent ruin. Others implored the passers-by for custom with the abject effect of begging alms, while in still others, this feverish urgency was disguised by an air of martyrdom or of shamefaced unwantedness, as if peddling were beneath the dignity of their habitual occupations, and they had been driven to it by sheer famine, by the hopeless dearth of employment at their own trades. One of these was a thick-set fellow of 25 or 26 with honest, clever blue eyes. It might be due to the genial, inviting quality of his face that Passover dishes, whose praises he was sounding, had greater attraction for some of the women with an effectual demand than those of his competitors. Still, his competitive success had not yet reconciled him to his new calling. He was constantly gazing about for a possible passerby of his acquaintance, and when one came in sight, he would seek refuge from identification in closer communion with the crockery on his pushcart. Buy nice dishes for the holidays. Cheap and strong, buy dishes for Passover. When business was brisk, he sang with a bashful relish. When the interval between a customer and her successor was growing too long, his sing-song would acquire a mournful ring that was suggested of the psalms chanting at an Orthodox Jewish funeral. He was a cap blocker, and in the busy season, his earnings ranged from $10 to $15 a week. But he had not worked full-time for over 2 years, and during the last 3 months, he had not been able to procure a single day's employment. Goldie, his sweetheart too, who was employed in making knee breeches, had hardly work enough to pay her humble board and rent. Nathan, after much hesitation, was ultimately compelled to take to peddling, and the longed-for day of their wedding was put off from month to month. They had become engaged nearly 2 years before, the wedding ceremony having been originally fixed for a date some 3 months later. Their joint savings then amounted to $120, a sum quite adequate in Nathan's judgment for a modest, quiet celebration and the humble beginning of a household establishment. Goldie, however, summarily and indignantly overruled it. One does not marry every day, she argued, and when I have at last lived to stand under the bridal canopy with my predestined one, I will not do so like a beggar maid. Give me a respectable wedding or none at all. Nathan, do you hear me?
When she said my predestined one, what did she really say? What was the word she really said?
She wanted a big wedding.
What was the word that she used? Predestined one, basherta, right? She said, if I'm going to stand under the chuppah with my basherta, it's going to be a real wedding, right? Right, bashert, right? Predestined, meant for it, meant to happen.
It is to be noted that a respectable wedding was not merely a casual expression with Goldie. Like its antithesis, a slipshod wedding, it played in her vocabulary the part of something like a well-established scientific term with a meaning as clearly defined as that of centrifugal force or geometrical progression. Now, a slipshod wedding was anything short of a gown of white satin and slippers to match, 2 carriages to bring the bride and the bridegroom to the ceremony, and one to take them to their bridal apartments, a wedding bard and a band of at least 5 musicians, a spacious ballroom crowded with dancers, and a feast of 150 covers. As to furniture, she refused to consider any which did not include a pier glass and a Brussels carpet.
Does anybody know what a pier glass is?
No.
Too bad. Come on. Yes. All right, wait. Here comes Beryl.
A mirror?
A mirror.
Okay. Good.
Is a Brussels carpet just a carpet from Brussels, or is that a specific? Okay. Nathan contended that the items upon which she insisted would cost a sum far beyond their joint accumulations. This she met by the declaration that he had all along been bent upon making her the target of universal ridicule, and that she would rather descend into an untimely grave than be married to us in a slipshod manner. Here she burst out crying, and whether her tears referred to the untimely grave or the slipshod wedding, they certainly seemed to strengthen the cogency of her argument. For Nathan at once proceeded to signify his surrender by a kiss. And when ignominiously repulsed, he protected his determination to earn the necessary money to bring things to the standard which she held up so uncompromisingly. Hard times set in. Nathan and Goldie pinched and scrimped, but all their heroic economies were powerless to keep their capital from dribbling down to less than $100. The wedding was postponed again and again. Finally, the curse of utter idleness fell upon Nathan's careworn head. Their savings dwindled apace. In dismay, they beheld the foundation of their happiness melt gradually away. Both were tired of boarding. Both longed for the bliss and economy of married life. They grew more impatient and restless every day, and Goldie made concession after concession. First, the wedding supper was sacrificed, then the pier mirror, and the bard was stricken from the program, and these were eventually succeeded by the hired hall and the Brussels carpet. After Nathan went into peddling a few days before we first find him hawking chinaware on Grand Street, matters began to look brighter, and the spirits of our betrothed couple rose. Their capital, which had sunk to $40, was increasing again, and Goldie advised waiting long enough for it to reach the sum necessary for a slipshod wedding and establishment. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Nathan, absently drawling his buy nice dishes for the holidays, his mind was engrossed with the question of making peddling his permanent occupation. Presently, he was startled by a merry soprano mocking him. Buy nice dishes. Mind that you don't fall asleep murmuring like this. A big lot you can make. Nathan turned a smile to an affectionate surprise upon a compact little figure, small to drollness, but sweet in the amusing grace of its diminutive outlines, the epitome of exquisite femininity. Her tiny face was as comically lovely as her form. Her apple-like cheeks were firm as marble, and her inadequate nose protruded between them as the result of a hasty tweak, a pair of large, round black eyes, and thick-lipped little mouth inundating it all with passion and restless, good-natured shrewdness. Goldie, what brings you here? Nathan demanded with a fond look, which instantly gave way to an air of discomfort. You know I hate you seeing me peddling. Are you angry with me? Bite the feather bed then. Where is the disgrace? As if you were the only peddler in America. I wish you were. Wouldn't you make heaps of money then? But you had better hear what does bring me here. Nathan, darling, dearest little heart, dearest little crown that you are. Guess what a plan I have hit upon, she exploded all at once. Well, if you hear me out and you don't say that Goldie has the head of a cabinet minister, then, well, then you will be a big hog and nothing else. And without giving him time to put it in as much as an interjection, she rattled on, puffing for breath and smacking her lips for ecstasy. Was it not stupid of them to be racking their brains about a wedding while there was such a plain way of having both a respectable celebration and fine furniture, Brussels carpet, pier glass, and all, with the money they now had on hand? Come, out with it then, he said morosely. But his disguised curiosity only whetted her appetite for tormenting him, and she declared her determination not to disclose her great scheme before they had reached her lodgings. You have been yelling long enough today, anyhow, she said with abrupt sympathy. Do you suppose it does not go to my very heart to think of the way you stand out in the cold screaming yourself hoarse? Half an hour later, when they were alone in Mrs. Volpiansky's parlor, which was also Goldie's bedroom, she set about emptying his pockets of the gross results of the day's business and counting the money. This she did with a preoccupied, matter-of-fact air, Nathan submitting to the operation with fond and amused willingness, and the sum being satisfactory. She went on to unfold her plan. You see, she began almost in a whisper, and with the mien of a careworn, experience-laden old matron, in a week or two, we shall have about $75, shan't we? Well, what is $75? Nothing. We could just have the plainest furniture and no wedding worth speaking of. Now, if we have no wedding, we shall have no presents, shall we? Nathan shook his head thoughtfully. Why shouldn't we be up to snuff and do this way? Let us spend all our money on a grand, respectable wedding and send out a big lot of invitations. And then, well, won't Uncle Lizer send us a carpet or a parlor set, and Aunt Beale and Cousin Shapiro, Aunt Bealey?
Ayla.
Aunt Bela, I'm not used to seeing it spelled that way, and Aunt Bella and Cousin Shapiro and Charlie and Meyerke and Wolfke and Benny and Sorgiti won't each present something or other as is the custom among respectable people? My God, give us a lump sum of good luck as big as the wedding present each of them is sure to send us. Why did not Belka get a fine carpet from Uncle when she got married? And I am And am I not a nearer relative than she? She paused to search his face for a sign of approval, and fondly smoothing a tuft of his dark hair into place, she went on to enumerate the friends to be invited and the gifts to be expected from them. So you see, she pursued, we will have both a respectable wedding that we shan't have to be ashamed of in after years, and the nicest things we could get if we spend $200. What do you say? What shall I say? He returned dubiously. The project appeared reasonable enough, but the investment struck him as rather hazardous. He pleaded for caution, for delay. But as he had no tangible argument to produce, while she stood her ground with the firmness of conviction, her victory was an easy one. It will all come right. Depend on it, she said coaxingly. You just leave everything to me. Don't be uneasy, Nathan, she added. You and I are orphans, and you know the uppermost does not forsake a bride and groom who have nobody to take care of them. If my father were alive, it would be different, she concluded with a disconsolate gesture. There was a pathetic pause. Tears glistened in Goldie's eyes. May your father rest in bright paradise, Nathan said feelingly. But what is the use of crying? Can you bring him back to life? I will be a father to you. If God be pleased, she assented. With that, Mama, at least, may she be healthy 120 years. With that, she, at least, we're here to attend our wedding. Poor mother, it will break her heart to think that she has not been foreordained by the uppermost to lead me under the canopy. There was another desolate pause, but it was presently broken by Goldie, who exclaimed with unexpected buoyancy, by the way, Nathan, guess what I did? I am afraid you will call me braggart and make fun of me, but I don't care, she pursued with all her playful pout, as she produced a strip of carpet from her pocket. I went into a furniture store and they gave me a sample 3 times as big as this. I explained in my letter to Mother that this is the kind of stuff that will cover my floor when I am married. Then I enclosed the sample in the letter and sent it all to Russia. Nathan clapped his hands and burst out laughing. But how do you know that that is just the kind of carpet you will get for your wedding present? He demanded, amazed as much as amused. How do I know? As if it mattered what sort of carpet. I can see Mama going the rounds of the neighbors and showing off the costly tablecloth her daughter will trample on. Won't she be happy? Over 100 invitations printed in as luxurious a black and gold as ever came out of an Essex Street hand press were sent out for an early date in April. Goldie and Nathan paid a month's rent in advance for 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of a Cherry Street tenement house. Goldie regarded the rent as unusually low and the apartments as the finest on the east side. Oh, haven't I got lovely rooms, she would ejaculate, beaming. With the consciousness of the pronoun, or you ought to see my rooms. How much do you pay for yours? Or again, I have made up my mind to have my parlor in the rear room. It is as light as the front one anyhow, and I want that for the kitchen, you know. What do you say? For hours together, she would go on talking nothing but rooms, rent, and furniture. Every married couple who had recently moved into new quarters or were about to do seemed bound to her by the ties of common cause. In her imagination, humanity was divided into those who were interested in the question of rooms, rent, and furniture, and those who were not. The former, of whom she was one, constituting the superior category, and whenever her eye fell upon a bill announcing rooms to let, she would experience something akin to feeling with which an artist in passing views some accessory of his art. It is customary to send the bulkier wedding presents to a young couple's apartment a few days before they become man and wife. The closer relatives and friends of the betrothed usually settling among themselves what piece of furniture each is to contribute. Accordingly, Goldie gave up her work a week in advance of the date set for the great event in order that she might be on hand to receive the things when they arrived. She went to the empty little rooms with her lunch early in the morning and kept anxious watch till after nightfall when Nathan came to take her home. A day passed, another, and a third, but no expressman called out her name. She sat waiting and listening for the rough voice, but in vain. Oh, it is too early, anyhow. I am a fool to be expecting anything so soon at all, she tried to console herself. And she waited another hour, and still another, but no wedding gift made its appearance. Well, there is plenty of time after all. Wedding presents do come a day or two before the ceremony, she argued. And again she waited, and again she strained her ears, and again her heart rose in her throat. The vacuity of the rooms, freshly cleaned, scrubbed, and smelling of whitewash, began to frighten her. Her overwrought mind was filled with sounds which her overstrained ears did not hear. Yet there she sat on the windowsill, leaning and listening for an expressman's voice. Hush, 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 whispered the walls. The corners muttered awful threats. Her heart was ever and anon contracted with fear. She often thought herself on the brink of insanity, yet she stayed on, waiting, waiting, waiting. At the slightest noise in the hall, she would spring to her feet, her heart beating wildly, only presently to sink in her bosom at finding it to be some neighbor or a peddler. And so frequent were these violent throbbings that Goldie grew to imagine herself a prey to a heart disease. Nevertheless, the fifth day came and she was again at her post, waiting, waiting, waiting for her wedding gifts. And what is more, when Nathan came from business and his countenance fell as he surveyed the undisturbed emptiness of the rooms, she set a merry face against his rueful inquiries and took to bantering him as a woman quick to lose heart and to painting their prospects in roseate hues until she argued herself, if not him, into a more cheerful view of the situation. On the sixth day, an expressman did pull up in front of the Cherry Street tenement, but he had only a cheap, huge rocking chair for Goldie and Nathan. And as it proved to be a gift of a family who had been set down for nothing less than a carpet or a parlor set, the joy and hope which its advent had called forth turned to dire disappointment and despair. For nearly an hour, Goldie sat mournfully, rocking and striving to picture how delightful it would have been if all her anticipations had come true. Presently, there arrived a flimsy, plush-covered little corner table. It could not have cost more than $1, yet it was the gift of a near friend who had been relied upon for a pier glass or a bedroom set. A little later, a cheap alarm clock and an icebox were brought in. That was all. Occasionally, Goldie went to the door to take in the entire effect, but the more she tried to view the parlor as half-finished, the more cruelly did the few lonely and mismatched things emphasize the remaining emptiness of the apartments, whereupon she would sink into her rocker and sit motionless with a drooping head and then desperately fall to swaying to and fro as though bent upon swinging herself out of her woe-begone, wretched self. Still, when Nathan came, there was a triumphant twinkle in her eye as she said, pointing to the gifts, "Well, mister, who was right? It is not very bad for a start. You know most people do send their wedding presents after the ceremony. Why, of course," she added in a sort of confidential way. "Well, we have invited a big crowd and all people of no mean sort, thank God. And who ever heard of a lady or a gentleman attending a respectable wedding and having a grand wedding supper and then cheating the bride and groom out of their present?" The evening was well advanced, yet there were only a score was used to hundreds. Everybody felt ill at ease, and ever and anon looked about for the possible arrival of more guests. At 10 o'clock, the dancing preliminary to the ceremony had not yet ceased, although the few waltzers looked as if they were scared by the ringing echoes of their own footsteps amid the austere solemnity of the surrounding void and the depressing sheen of the dim expanse of floor. The two fiddles, the cornet and the clarinet, were shrieking as though for pain, and the malicious superabundance of gaslight was fiendishly sneering at their torches. Weddings and entertainments were scarce in the ghetto. Its musicians caught the contagion of misery, hence the greedy, desperate gusto with which the band plied their instruments. At last it became evident that the assemblage was not destined to be larger than it was, and that it was no use delaying the ceremony. It was, in fact, an open secret among those present that by far the greater number of invited guests were kept away by lack of employment, some having their presentable clothes in the pawn shop, others avoiding the expense of a wedding present, or simply being too cruelly borne down by their cares to have a mind for the excitement of a wedding. Indeed, some even thought it was wrong of Nathan to have the celebration during such a period of hard times when everybody was out of work. It was a little after 10 when the bard, a tall, gaunt man with a grizzly beard and a melancholy face, donned his skull cap and, advancing toward the dancers, called out in a synagogue intonation, "Come, ladies, let us veil the bride." An odd dozen of daughters of Israel followed him and the musicians into a little side room where Goldie was seated between her two brideswomen, the wives of two men who were to attend upon the groom. According to the Orthodox custom, she had fasted the whole day, and as a result of this and of her gnawing grief, added to the awe-inspiring scene that she had been awaiting. She was pale as death, the effect being heightened by the wreath and white gown she wore. As the procession came filing in, she sat blinking her round dark eyes in dismay, as if the bard were an executioner come to lead her to the scaffold. The song or address to the bride usually partakes of the qualities of prayer and harangue, and includes a melancholy meditation upon life and death, lamenting the deceased members of the young woman's family, bemoaning her own woes and exhorting her to discharge her sacred duties as a wife, mother, and servant of God. Composed in verse and declaimed in a solemn, plaintive recitation, often broken by the band's mournful refrain, it is sure to fulfill its mission by eliciting tears even when hearts are brimful of glee. Imagine then the funeral effect which it produced in Goldie's wedding ceremony. The bard, half starved himself, sang the anguish of his own heart. The violins wept, the clarinet moaned, the cornet and the double bass groaned, each reciting the sad tale of its poverty-stricken master. He began, "Silence, good woman, give heed to my verses. Tonight, bride, thou dost stand before the uppermost. Pray to him to bless thy union, to let thee and thy mate live 120 peaceful years, to give you your daily bread, to keep hunger from your door." Several women, including Goldie, burst into tears, the others sadly lowering their gaze. The band sounded a wailing chord, and the whole audience broke into loud, heart-rending weeping. The bard went on sternly, "Wail, bride, wail. This is a time of tears. Think of thy past days. Alas, they are gone to return nevermore." Heedless of the convulsive sobbing with which the room resounded, he continued to declaim, and at last, his eyes flashing fire and his voice tremulous with emotion, he sang out in a dismal, uncanny high key, "And thy good mother beyond the seas, and thy father in his grave, near where thy cradle was rocked, weep, bride, weep, though his soul is better off than we are here underneath, in dearth and cares and careless pangs. Weep, sweet bride, weep." Then, in the general outburst that followed the extemporaneous verse, there was a cry, "The bride is fainting. Water, quick." "Murderer that you are," flamed out an elderly matron with an air of admiration for the bard's talent as much as of wrath for the far-fetched results it achieved. Goldie was brought to, and the rest of the ceremony passed without accident. She submitted to everything in a dream. when the bridegroom, escorted by 2 attendants, each carrying a candelabra, holding lighted candles, came to place the veil over her face, she stared about as though she failed to realize the situation or to recognize Nathan. When, keeping time to the plaintive strains of a time-honored tune, she was led, blindfolded, into the large room and stationed beside the bridegroom under the red canopy, and then marched around him 7 times. She obeyed instructions and moved about with the passivity of a hypnotic. After the 7 blessings had been recited, when the cantor gently lifting the end of her veil, presented the wineglass to her lips, she tasted its contents with an air of an invalid taking medicine. Then she felt the ring slip down her finger and heard Nathan say, "Be thou dedicated to me by this ring according to the laws of Moses and Israel." Whereupon she said to herself, "Now I am a married woman," but somehow at this moment the words were meaningless sounds to her. She knew she was married, but could not realize what it implied. As Nathan crushed the wineglass underfoot and the band struck up a cheerful melody, and the gathering shouted, "Good luck, good luck," and clapped their hands, while the older women broke into a wild hop. Goldie felt the relief of having gone through a great ordeal, but still she was not distinctly aware of any change in her position. Not until 15 minutes later, when she found herself in the basement at the head of one of 3 long tables, did the realization of her new self strike her consciousness full face, as it were. The dining room was nearly as large as the dancing hall on the floor above. It was as brightly illuminated, and the 3 tables, which ran almost the entire length, were set for 150 guests. Yet there were barely 20 to occupy them. The effect was still more depressing than in the dancing room. The vacant benches and the untouched covers still more agonizingly exaggerated the emptiness of the room in which the sorry handful of a company lost themselves. Goldie looked at the rows of plates, spoons, forks, knives, and they weighed her down with the cold dazzle of their solemn, pompous array. "I am not the Goldie I used to be," she said to herself. "I am a married woman, like Mama or Auntie or Mrs. Volpiansky, and we have spent every cent we had on this grand wedding, and now we are left without money for furniture, and there are no guests to send us any. The supper will be thrown out, and everything is lost, and I am to blame for it all." The glittering plates to hold whispered converse, and to exchange winks and grins at her expense. She transferred her glance to the company, and it appeared as if they were vainly forcing themselves to partake of the food, as though they, too, were looked out of countenance by the ruthless sparkle of the unused plates. Nervous silence hung over the room, and the reluctant jingle of the score of knives and forks made it more awkward and more enervating every second. Even the bard had not the heart to break the stillness by the merry rhymes he had composed for the occasion. Goldie was overpowered. She thought she was on the verge of another fainting spell, and shutting her eyes and setting her teeth, she tried to imagine herself dead. Nathan, who was by her side, noticed it. He took her hand under the table and, pressing it gently, whispered, "Do not take it to heart. There is a God in heaven." She could not make out his words, but she felt their meaning. As she was about to utter some phrase of endearment, her heart swelled in her throat, and a piteous, dove-like, tearful look was all the response she could make. By and by, however, when the foaming lager was served, tongues were loosened, and the bard, although distressed by the meager collection in store for him, but stirred by an ardent desire to relieve the insupportable wretchedness of the evening, outdid himself in offhand acrostics and witticism. Nevertheless, needless to say that his efforts were thankfully rewarded with unstinted laughter, and as the room rang with merriment. The gleaming rows of undisturbed plates also seemed to join in the general hubbub of mirth and to be laughing a hearty, kindly laugh. Presently, amid a fresh outbreak of deafening hilarity, Goldie bent close to Nathan's ear and exclaimed with sobbing vehemence, "My husband, my husband, my husband." "My wife," he returned in her ear. "Do you know what you are to me now?" she resumed. "A husband. I am your wife. Do you know what it means? Do you? Do you, Nathan?" she insisted with frantic emphasis. "I do, my little sparrow. Only don't worry over the wedding presents." It was after midnight, and even the ghetto was immersed in repose. Goldie and Nathan were silently wending their way to the 3 empty little rooms where they were destined to have their first joint home. They wore the wedding attire which they had rented for the evening. He a swallowtail coat and high hat, and she a white satin gown and slippers, her head uncovered, the wreath and veil done up in a newspaper in Nathan's hand. They had gone to the wedding in carriages, which had attracted large crowds both at the point of departure and in front of the hall. And of course, they had expected to make their way to their new home in a similar, respectable manner. Toward the close of the last dance, after supper, they found, however, that some small change was all they possessed in the world. The last strains of music were dying away. The guests in their hats and bonnets were taking leave. Everybody seemed in a hurry to get away to his own world and to abandon the young couple to their fate. Nathan would have borrowed $1 or $2 of some friend. "Let us go home as behooves a bride and bridegroom," he said. "There is a God in heaven. He will not forsake us." But Goldie would not hear of betraying the full measure of their poverty to their friends. "No, no," she retorted testily. "I am not going to let you pay $1.50 for a few blocks drive like a Fifth Avenue nobleman. We can walk." She pursued with the grim determination of one bent upon self-chastisement. A poor woman who dares spend every cent on a wedding must be ready to walk after the wedding. When they found themselves alone in the deserted street, they were so overcome by a sense of loneliness, of a kind of portentous, haunting emptiness, that they could not speak. So on they trudged in dismal silence, she leaning upon his arm and he tenderly pressing her to his side. Their way lay through the gloomiest and roughest part of the 7th Ward. The neighborhood frightened her and she clung closer to her escort. At one corner, they passed some men in front of a liquor saloon. Look at them, a sheeny feller and his bride, I betcha," shouted a husky voice. "Just coming from the wedding. She ain't no bigger than a peanut, is she?" The simile was greeted with a hoarse laugh. "Look a here, young fella. What the matter with de carrying that lady of yourn in your vest pocket?" When Nathan and Goldie were a block away, something like a potato or a carrot struck her in the back. At the same time, the gang of loafers on the corner broke in boisterous merriment. Nathan tried to face about, but she restrained him. "Don't, they may kill you," she whispered, and relapsed into silence. He made another attempt to disengage himself, as if for a desperate attack upon her assailants, but she nestled close to his side and held him fast, her every fiber tingling at the consciousness of the shelter she had in him. "Don't mind them, Nathan," she said. And they proceeded on their dreary way through a somber, impoverished street, with here and there a rustling tree, a melancholy witness of its better days. They felt a stream of happiness uniting them as it coursed through the veins of both, and they were filled with a blissful sense of oneness, the like of which they had never tasted before. So happy were they that the gang behind them and the bare rooms toward which they were directing their steps and the miserable failure of the wedding all suddenly appeared too insignificant to engage their attention. Paltry matters alien to their new life, remote from the enchanted world in which they now dwelt. The very notion of a relentless void abruptly turned to a beatific sense of beatific sense of their own seclusion, of their being only themselves in the universe, to live and delight in each other. Don't mind them, Nathan, darling, she repeated mechanically, conscious of nothing but the tremor of happiness in her voice. I should give it to them, he responded, gathering her still closer to him. I should show them how to touch my Goldie, my pearl, my birdie. They dived into a denser gloom of a side street. A gentle breeze ran past and ahead of them, proclaiming the bride and the groom. An old tree whispered overhead its tender felicitations.
That's the story.
I read, I get a creak in my neck.
Anybody want to react?
The one thing I thought of when they were looking ahead was something my mother said to me when she and my father got engaged. And they weren't going, my mother wasn't going to have an engagement ring because they wanted to save their money for furniture and everything. And my father's mother said, that's all. How did she said, she felt that that it was okay for them to get married, but they would not have her blessing because she said, my mother should have an engagement ring. They'll always, she says, you'll never buy the engagement ring later, but you'll always find money for furniture.
Right.
I thumbed for that somehow, but I think I got the point across.
Right.
What year did this date, was this supposed to be taking place?
This is in the, I don't know. Let's see if it's during the Depression. Let me check it one
The
more
late
time.
20s, early 30s?
Yeah, let me see if it says so at the beginning.
Well, it sounds as if it would be during the Depression, when a lot of people were out of work.
Yeah, but believe me, plenty of people were out of work before that too.
Yeah.
Well, there are a couple things in there that sort of just made me smile a little bit. One was the story about looking
I don't
through
know.
the,
I don't know what year.
Oh, okay. Well, it sounds, my mother was born in 1918, so it's maybe sort of somewhere around.
Yeah, yeah.
And she told me when she was a little girl, she and her sister used to look through the Sears catalog, and they would, circle each, they would take a turn and each would circle what they wanted, and they finish the page, and then they go to the next page and they'd get through the whole thing. It might have taken them 6 months. And my sister and I started that when we were little too. There was such a thing as a big fat Sears catalog. So that just made me smile. And then the idea of the carpet, this was later, but in the 70s, we had some friends from England who were over here on an expat couple of years. And they were telling us that in England then, nobody would think about getting married unless they had money to carpet. And this was, I guess, wall to wall, to carpet the house or the apartment. They would not get married until they had money for a carpet. They might not have money for a bed, but they would have money for a carpet. So that made me smile.
Right.
And then the last thing, I don't know if I ever told you this, but my husband had a friend, an Orthodox Jewish fella, and we were invited to his wedding in Brooklyn. And the men had those bear fur hats, and they were upstairs in a room, praying and the whole thing. And we were the only non-Orthodox people there. And my husband was the only non-Jew there. And he had a ball. He was, when they were circling the man and raising him up on the chair, and, he's throwing the guy up in the chair. We had a great time. I felt a little weird on the women's side because we weren't doing that and I didn't know anybody. But I'm just sort of picturing their wedding there with the dancing and all that. That was a sort of a nice memory.
There's a figure in the story called the Bard.
Yeah.
Right. There's the Yiddish term is the Badchen. That's what it's really called. And really a better translation, the jester.
Oh.
So this is a guy, but the description of what he was doing is actually quite accurate, because the jester is supposed to be doing stuff that it's a mitzvah to make the bride and groom happy and everybody else happy, so that everybody has a good time at the wedding. But it does begin with this kind of like somber, solemn, kind of recognition that in traditional practice, the bride and the groom fast because they want to cleanse themselves and get atonement. They want to enter their new life without any blemishes, without any sins. So of course, and if there's anybody that hasn't made it to the wedding and because they died earlier, then that's a sadness also. So this whole life cycle business is very beautifully portrayed in the in the story. And there are a lot of
Didn't rabbis do the ceremony?
all kinds of people. I mean, if you had a rabbi, a rabbi would cost so much money. A cantor would cost so much money. A reverend would cost so much money.
Yeah.
There was, and that's, that was part of the whole thing. This was like a whole industry. So, this was, variety of stuff. Yeah.
I have a very vivid memory at that wedding of when the wedding ceremony was supposed to start. I guess the father and the brothers and the uncle, all the people who were close to the groom, kind of escorted him from upstairs, downstairs, and slowly making their way to where the bride was sitting. He could hardly stand up, I guess, from sipping wine and fasting and all this, and nerves and all this stuff. And checking under her veil, and it was just a beautiful thing. I'd never seen anything like that. And it's a long time ago, but the memories remain strong.
Right. So Josie, then Carol.
Yeah, sorry.
I was really worried about the ending, and I was happy to see that Kahan is a romantic. In the end,
Absolutely.
talk about the furniture and the carpet is gone, and all the focus is on the bliss of this couple that now they're married and they're starting a new life. So I was relieved that it ended that way.
He's a romantic, and he's a social critic of society. He's a socialist. The Forward was a workers' paper.
Right.
And it was super concerned with the poor people, with the workers suffering. And what does he say about how do you imagine Goldie's own thinking? What's going on in her head as she's preparing for her new life? What is she trying to accomplish?
Trying to have a decent life with some basic necessities.
Yeah. So what does the wedding represent for her?
A new life.
Yeah, step up in her
Definitely,
whole,
right. A step up.
Step up.
This is like
Definitely.
going to to some kind of respectable realm, and she has this. She's a romantic also,
But also
she's a
in the
materialist romantic.
in
Yeah,
the
Carol.
beginning, in the beginning, it sounded like she was a snob.
Well, that's what
Which
happened.
is what she wanted. But
That's
going back to what Merle said about Orthodox weddings, I've been to 3 of them, and it's very interesting how it's all done and everything. And the latest one, where the bride and groom are separate, and the groom makes sure it's his,
Right.
before the bride is veiled, that is actually his bride, and that goes back to Leah, Jacob and Leah. So I mean, it's interesting, but I had the feeling as I was reading it that she was a snob. She wanted what she wanted, and she wasn't going to settle. And then when she ended up settling, because she thought people would give her certain things, and I gotta say this: my father-in-law went down the list on his side of the thing, and he knew how much everybody's check was going to be. And after Joe and I got back from our honeymoon, he gave us a day or two and to open up the envelopes, and he called the fleet and he wanted to know who gave what.
That's part of the terrible tragedy here, is that has this fantasy that everybody's doing okay, and that the village will take care of them, and somehow they'll get this wonderful start in life because of everybody. And then everybody's ashamed by their own tragedy, right? Everybody's ashamed by their own poverty. They can't even show up to the wedding because they're embarrassed to show up to the wedding, but not be able to give a decent present. So, there's this total, misalignment of her vision of what's out there and actually what really is out there. But part of this is about what Kahan is saying. She's got a heart. She loves this guy. This guy seems to be a really, really good man. and he's totally in love with her. But there's a push, I don't want to be hungry. I don't want to be poor. I want something better in life. This is such a common motivation and a common passion of a lot of people who have that sense of drive. I have an ambition. I don't want to be at the bottom of the ladder. I don't want to be suffering like this. So, unfortunately, the plan that she hatched was totally misguided. Like you say, thankfully, Kahan is romantic enough to at least keep her together with this guy, and they at least have the love for each other, right? So they learn a little bit of a lesson. Yeah.
So are you saying that underneath this is his criticism of a capitalist society in which
Yeah.
the poor stay poor?
I think so. Yes.
Factory owner gets
Right.
rich.
It's about how materialism ends up corrupting your spirit. And this is, a short story. And thankfully, the couple have each other, and he seems to be a little incorruptible about these things. So, so they have a saving grace, but the forces that are operating against them are horrible. And the pain of everybody in society, is something that he feels very deeply, and he feels that it's wrong. It's not just, oh, well, they happen to be poor. He thinks this is because of mismanagement of society. Yeah. Carol.
It's interesting because over the years you hear people who are adults or our age or something, that growing up we didn't know how poor we were and how parents made do and everything like that. And unfortunately, Goldie didn't see what was going on. She was so consumed with what she wanted that she didn't see what was going on. And the invited guests instead could not afford, didn't want to embarrass themselves. And even when the inexpensive things were showing up, she didn't get it.
Well, you have to understand also, she's a self-made person. She's an orphan of her father, and her mother's back in Russia. So who's taking care of her? She's a young woman in a very harsh world, and she needs to be as tough as she can be. I mean, in the end, she comes out, thankfully, she has a heart. She knows what's real and what isn't. She knows that Nathan is right by her side, and that's what counts. So she went through a very stormy little challenge, and thankfully it seems like they have each other and can try to keep on going. And that's the happy ending for this week.
All right.
All right. Zag is into everybody.
Thank
Take care.
you.